everyone. I hope you've been enjoying the GLF climate as much as I have. My name is Lucy. I'm a Bachelor of Environmental Engineering graduate, young climate activist from Peru, and also your moderator for today. And on behalf of the Youth in Landscape Initiative and the Global Landscape Forum, I welcome all of you to the last Youth Daily show of the GLF Climate Everett Conference. We are very, very happy to have you here from wherever you're watching. So let's start. More and more people, especially young people like us, have been joining the climate movement in the past few years. For example, by making individual changes in their everyday lives, such as changing their diet or the way they commute, joining a climate strike, or even joining a collective. I'm sure many of us often ask ourselves these questions like, what can we do? What can I do? Will my individual action make any difference at all? And what does it mean to pursue collective and systematic change? At least I ask myself these questions a lot. Well, today I hope we are going to get some entry points and tools that can help us better explore these questions. For that, I'm very glad to have here with me today Josephine Becker, a climate activist, movement organizer, and Ph.D. candidate in Galicia, Spain. Welcome, Josephine. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I feel super honored and really excited for this conversation.
Thank you, Josephine. So, Joe, as you for sure know, around 2 months ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, released a report discussing the state of the climate crisis, and it made headlines across traditional and social media as code red for humanity. Everyone pointed out that, once again, the science around the urgency and certainty about the climate crisis is clear. However, many also point out that framing humanity as a whole, like all humans, as responsible for the climate crisis can perpetuate false narratives and be counterproductive to identifying the drivers, as well as to finding a strength and hope to address the climate crisis too. So my question is, who or what is really responsible for the climate crisis? Joe, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good and important but big question. So I think, this report is, got in all of the headlines, I would say, especially where I'm based here in Europe. I think it shook up a lot of people. And I think that's exactly the issue that we're talking about here, that in Europe, for example, and I'm speaking from this perspective as I'm based here, we kind of frame this climate crisis as something that's like only happening now or over the last 10, 20 years, when actually it's been a crisis that's been established by exactly the same forces here over the last centuries, over 500 years plus, where through colonialism and industrialization, we have established a crisis that's only now coming more and more to the forefront exactly in those same spaces. So even now, of course, the climate crisis is already real as well in Europe, and a lot of people have suffered already under it, but the realities are still very fluffy and for many people who continuously benefit of the climate crisis and have so over the, over decades and centuries, actually. I was based in Scotland over the past 5 years, and the UK has one of the longest, if not the longest, history of industrialization, and through their colonialism, for example, have gone abroad, to take resources, to do land grabbing, to do all of these environmental injustices, and to impoverish local regions for their own gain, and which is why now they have a certain living standard. And so we, continue to experience this today as well, where the forms have a bit changed of how, colonialism is expressed, but actually the same forces continue, where, the UK and other European states continue to refuse to take actually drastic action on the climate change. They export their dirty industries in other spaces. And, so we continue to see the same patterns, and continuously we actually face the same issues of, well, let's just blame it on the majority actually of people, even though that's not actually true. And we also have to consider that, you know, there's 100 companies that since 1988 are responsible for 71% of the emissions, which, you know, we actually as a collective, like in Europe, for example, have profited of, but also suffer from, and are not actually individually responsible. So I think there's a lot going on where, like, not all of humanity has profited on, like has created the climate crisis, but many people have profited of it. But at the same time, me as an individual also has not created this crisis, you know? And yeah, so I think it's really important we frame it as such, because we need to address the underlying issues rather than always think of climate crisis as, you know, creating super new issues. I think of it more as a symptom or an expression or an extension of other crises that have been there for centuries.
Thank you, Joe, so much. I think it's what some people said. It's not what we have to change the climate, we have to change the system. So I think you part of respond the next question about what does it matter how we frame the climate crisis. So let's move to this question. Why is it so important to share stories about who is experiencing climate change firsthand?
I mean, first of all, I think it breaks up the narratives of, you know, historical erasure around and what's still happening around, like, you know, who is experiencing the climate crisis. The climate crisis can't just matter when it affects us individually, but, you know, fellow humans are worth fighting for, and people are already impacted by the climate crisis. And, you know, we deserve, like, everybody deserves to have safe and thriving conditions. And so whether or not I'm personally impacted by the climate crisis or not already, like, of course it matters, but also, like, it doesn't, because actually, like, everyone deserves to have the same, you know, living standards and the same preconditions. And so I think in that sense, but also, like, when we look for for solutions to fight the climate crisis, right? Like, if people already face the climate crisis, they already have solutions how they are right now organizing, how they are making things work. And actually, like, it's time we change the narratives of always thinking that, you know, that has been framed also in the sustainability development discourse around, like, oh, you have to save the earth, or you have to save these people. Like, actually, like, we shouldn't be anyone's savior, but we can turn to them for solutions, and actually this time learn from people, you know, who are at the front lines and who shouldn't be at the front lines, but who are, and their voices, like, you know, deserve to be centered, and we should follow actually their calls of actions and what we can do to support them and to, you know, prevent further injustices. Because I think there's also this point around, you know, we can't always just act when crisis has happened. Like, we need to prevent every single bit of crisis, and in the climate crisis especially, like, every small tiny, like, digit around temperature, around sea level rise, like, has massive amounts of impact. So I think the framing of how and who's responsible, but also who we can turn to and who we should turn to for solutions, is super important. And I often think of this quote by Dr. Kyle White, who is from Turtle Island, and he talks about how indigenous people already live in post-apocalyptic times. And, you know, like, something that I only think of, like, in the future is already has happened to other people right now around climate catastrophe. And so, you know, like, why do I have to imagine what it's like to have this personal experience when actually, like, I could just turn to people and learn from them of how, you know, how to deal and how to make things work and how to prevent further things. So yeah.
Yeah, it's very deep what you said, because there's a lot of people who's already suffering the climate crisis. A lot of media says, yeah, the future climate crisis, the future, it's going to be worse, but now it's where we have to take action, because there's a lot of people suffering. Well, thanks for that also. Now that we have discussed in a nutshell the drivers and the framing around the climate crisis, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on individual and systematic change. Can you briefly share with us what do we mean when we talk about individual change and also systematic change for the climate crisis?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that like a lot of strikes, especially like the school strikers, have been, you know, like this messaging on like individual change and system change has been kind of, yeah, just been in the headlines quite a lot. And I think also from my personal experience, the way that I was, for example, taught around climate change was very much like looking at this individual change. So I would say this approach is more, you know, you can do like these actions in your daily life, you know, and then magically the climate crisis will disappear. You know, if you take shorter showers, immediately someone else will have more water. Or if you don't waste your food, you know, then someone else will have more food. And these are kind of like these stories of, you know, I would say, especially like Western European middle class, upper class ways to address the climate crisis without making us uncomfortable, and maybe the way that we profit off the climate crisis, the way that our behavior also drives systemic injustices. And I think that kind of brings me to this like systemic approach where we are looking more at the conditions that shape the ways that we live. So, you know, that can be education, our political systems, that can be our economic frameworks that we live in, you know, the way that we consume and the way that everything kind of like looks around capital accumulation, but also like knowledge and values, for example, right? Like these. So yeah, I would say it's more like the kind of like the landscape or like the way that informs us in the way that, you know, what's the status quo in our society, and that can be, for example, the consumption and like, you know, buying. And so yeah, and so when we think of like these two frameworks around the climate crisis, like I mentioned, there's this call for individual change, you know, like shower less. So when we have these calls for systematic changes, we look also at the redistribution aspects of injustices and the dismantling of the injustices in the first place. Like, where do they come from? And, you know, why does the one person have more water than the other person? And, you know, me actually individually saying like, I'm going to shower less, you know, what are the driving, like what are the barriers where, or like what are the factors that will actually redistribute water, if at all? And right now that's exactly like why so many school strikers and other people in the environmental spaces, you know, are saying like actually individual action is not enough, because first of all, I'm not solely responsible for the climate crisis. Therefore, solely, I also don't have all of the solutions that can like master all of these big issues, which are systemic, because our society is structured in a way, you know, that is based on fossil fuels, that is based on waste. You know, when it's easier actually to waste something than to redistribute food or to repair something, then, you know, me as an individual, I can only do so much, but at some point there will always be barriers to be more sustainable, quote unquote. Like if the system you are part of is inherently exploitative, then it's almost impossible to not fall into this trap, right? And that's actually really hard, I think, for a lot of us to face. Like, I can only do so much, but at some point, like a lot of the spaces I'm part of are inherently unsustainable and inherently destructible. And that's something really grim, I think, we have to face. And I think a lot of school strikers and a lot of people are now calling for exactly this, like, I can't do it all, so let's change the barriers and let's change the conditions that have created this situations in the first place.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think that it's something that it also happened here in Latin America and Caribbean. Sometimes the media itself put us too much fault in something that it's not only our contribution as consumers, it's what you said, barriers and political things that also make this inequality being worse day by day. So yeah, thank you very much. Oftentimes, individual and systematic change are treated as two opposite viewpoints, as if you can either choose one or the other, or as if only one of them or the other is the way forward. For example, someone that is in favor of individual changes might consider systematic change like too abstract, while on the other hand, someone who supports systematic changes might think of individual changes as insignificant for the bigger picture. In your own view, what is the relationship between these two? Is there a missing link we should start discussing more?
Yeah, also thank you for sharing that about your own background. And I think like adding on to that as well, like when we think of like for example, like the factories that like or like the fossil fuel industry that, you know, has so much power and like contributes like, you know, over 70% of the emissions, like then me as an individual, you know, I can refuse X, Y, and Z, but the bigger picture is still really massive. And I think it brings me exactly to like your next point, what you were saying, because I'm not sure that it's helpful to have this either or approach, because like, why do we fight each other in our ways that we tackle the climate crisis when actually we could like put these two together and create a lot stronger movement and coalition, and also like stop fighting each other, trying to shape this world for the better. I think where the conflict exists is when we say that the one is better than the other. And I mean, coming from like a place where I was also taught that individual change will change everything, I had to kind of learn painfully that it really doesn't, but that still my individual choices do matter, because I, for example, live in a country that is very industrialized. I have financial stability. I have, you know, various outlets and various positions where I can actually enact change, and where I do have to reduce my consumption, and I have the privilege to do so. Like I can, you know, avoid buying fast fashion, and I can do, like I can choose my food and all of these things. But saying that this is the only way that we will change is not only quite destructive to the people who don't have certain like choices, even though they usually live like more sustainable anyways. But if we frame it in a way that you have to like take like these certain boxes and only that makes you an environmental activist or something, I think it's very exclusionary. And it follows actually this approach that has created the climate crisis in the first place, which is, you know, telling others what to do and creating certain hierarchies, and also follows and like upholds this capitalist framework of, you know, you have to kind of buy yourself outside, like out of the climate crisis. Whereas the systematic approach, I think it forgets that we as individuals are part of systems, and we can either uphold the system as it is right now, but also we can change the systems through us and as individuals, right? Like we exist, like systems are everywhere, right? Like I have certain values that are obviously shaped by the systems I'm part of, but I also am unlearning a lot of them, and I'm learning new values, and I'm learning new knowledge, and I exist in community that, you know, that on a personal level, I have interactions where the more we, for example, talk with each other and create practices in our own little spaces, the more like the ripples, like these ripple out changes create also new systems. So I don't think that like this binary framework of thinking you can only do one or the other is actually helpful at all, because I think also the systematic approach, when it's used in a way that like, oh, I can just do my toxic behaviors because the system overall is toxic, then actually like I think that's an excuse to not interrogate our own, you know, whether that's values or behaviors or whatever. Like we all have power to change the systems we are part of, and as long as we don't frame it as this like one way of how that's, you know, how that's done, I think all of this can and should coexist. And I think this like tapping more into like the plurality of the frameworks that we can change, I think that's where like the power lies, rather than always fighting each other who's doing the right one way of you know, doing individual or systematic change. Like I don't think it's helpful.
I totally agree with you. I think it's something very common when we start to fight each other for that, but it's like act, but also demand, like both of them, and take responsibility of our own context. Like you said, the privilege we all have some. So, well, now an individual can recognize the need to change and demand collective or system change without making any change in their own life. Of course, to the extent that their circumstances allow it. On the other hand, some people might make a lot of changes in their own life, but never exemplify or communicate these changes to their social groups. Is there a way you would encourage people to explore the value not only in systematic changes, but also in individual ones?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think, sometimes facing these really big systems that have gone on for centuries can be super overwhelming. And I think as much as they are super important to contextualize and to also learn from, I do think there is power in this individual change to a certain extent, where you might feel like you're winning in more short-term scales, because there are certain things that we fight against that you can't see the win effect immediately, right? And that's okay, but also like allowing yourself certain things that you can on the way celebrate and feel like you are making progress. And I think for me that's usually in community. I used to have that, was, for example, reducing my plastic waste and like kind of collecting like my plastic waste and see how much I have less this month or something. But for me, at some point, that also became kind of this like really, really, I don't know, I was just focused on that. And like, it was almost kind of like in the beginning, it was really like encouraging and stuff. But then at the same time, I also got super overwhelmed with actually the enormity that I can't change. And I think that's exactly where individual change can be supportive, but also kind of like disruptive to our well-being and to actually the power of change through community. And I think especially when we're in community, like we can like talk with others about this progress, about like the way that we are changing our lifestyle. And that I also mean like values and the knowledge and saying no to things and disrupting the status quo. And a lot of that takes super much effort, but we don't have this like tangible effect. And I think sometimes we need this tangible effect because we live in systems that have told us and have taught us to have like, to like be rewarded through tangible effects, almost like, I don't know, even school through grading systems and like all of these things, which I'm not sure how helpful they are a lot of times, like long term, but right now, sometimes I still catch myself, I still have that internalized. So sometimes it's just nice to have this like small win. And I think that's especially where individual change comes in, but also the way that, like sometimes, like, for example, for me in Scotland or right now in Spain, where I'm based, it's actually quite easy to attend a protest because of my positionality. Like I'm a white woman, able-bodied, and I have a lot of privilege through that to attend a protest, where sometimes like talking to my closer community, maybe there it's harder for me to talk about the climate crisis, talk about capitalism and white supremacy, but exactly there's also where my power actually lies in changing, in tapping into relationships and tapping into this like, in this relationship, in creating change in interpersonally. And sometimes that's usually harder, but also that's usually where more power and more change comes from. So that is also individual change, right? It's not just what I'm refusing or reducing, but it's also this power of, I'm changing my relationships and I'm trying to change my community. And so I would say 100% go for that.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that answer. I think it involves a lot of deep things too. I really like what you said about community and being patient with our own fight with our own struggles, because at least here in Peru, there are a lot of people that are still fighting, and we have to remember that women's rights, the 8 hours of work didn't make it like in one day, weren't make it by just a group of people. They were making in many, many years and by many, many people from every part of the country. So as those fights that are still existing right now, I think climate crisis and our fight against it and against the system that support it, it's a fight that it's going to take years, but we have to be together and, like you said, like step by step. Don't put too much pressure on our ways, because it's not going to work like that. I'm very, very happy to know your perspective, Joe. I know that these questions are very complex, but my next question is an easy one. So what's your story? Like, where did you start from? Was it individual change, or was it an understanding of the need for systematic change that firstly got you involved into all this climate movement?
I mean, I think I grew up in Germany, and I was raised by parents and a community that was very political and very taught me a lot on history, about being very vocal about injustices, and I think in that way I thought a lot about system and politics, and how we have to be actively changing kind of the larger picture. But I think also in the same way, I was fed a lot of this individual, also white savior, the burden lies on you, and you will make it, and just refuse even more plastic, and then we will make it. And I definitely, when I first started getting involved in more climate action, that was definitely my starting point, this individual change approach. And I'm super glad that immediately, actually, I was kind of called in by community members where, they taught me but you can't save the earth. And I was like, whoa, you're telling me everything's wrong that I just learned. And I'm so grateful for them, because they really invested a lot in me, in teaching me, you also have to look at the bigger pictures. So I still continued with my individual change, and I think it was a really valuable lessons for me. But at the same time, I was also already politically very active. So I think for me, it was this, I was in my own life, I was putting way too much pressure on me around individual change. But to other people, I would always say, do what you can, but systematic change is definitely that's what we should fight for. But internally, I was still doing this individual change battle. And so I think it was helpful to get me where I am now. But if people can skip this kind of very self-destructive, everything lies on your shoulder, then I would say, go for that.
Thank you, Joe, very much. I think, there's a point in our lives, in our youth, where we open the eyes and we cannot close them again, that, oh my God, the world is not that beautiful as I thought when I was a child. Thank you, Joe, for sharing your thoughts with us. You mentioned that you're co-creating a podcast, the Jikes podcast. Could you share more about the topics you're discussing there, the creation process, and what you're aiming to achieve through this podcast?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm hosting it with my lovely friend, Michaela Loach, and we were very involved in Scotland in climate movements and other social movements, grassroots organizing. And we just felt that what we had also experienced and what we also heard from others was that a lot barriers exist for people to join social movements, and there's, you know, fear, or there might be other, like, just like language that like gets used a lot in social movement spaces, and that can be like really intimidating for people to join, or you don't know what your role could be, all of these things. And so we wanted to start this podcast basically to help people, like, to use it as an educational tool, to get people more involved in activism and social movements. Also, both of us do a lot on social media, especially Instagram, which is great as an educational tool, but also it's not a space for discussions. It's not a space for nuance. And so having to reduce like super complex discussions to, you know, one grid post is actually not just not helpful, but sometimes also actually fires back in reducing, you know, like super complex things to actually, yeah, kind of like one point, and actually you do a lot more harm sometimes with it by reducing or erasing other points. And so we wanted to start this podcast because, and yeah, it's called, you know, the Yikes podcast, so kind of like the yikes of the world. And rather than like running away from it and, you know, this saying of like ignorance is bliss, like we reverse it and think like, you know, yes, it's really freaking hard, but let's lean into it, and let's do it as a community, and where we can learn together and we can face these things. And then, you know, we always give points of actions, like how can people learn more, how can people get involved in this topic, how can we practice this in our everyday lives. And so we hope to kind of just erase this narrative of like, you know, you just learn about the state of the world and then you have to face it on your own. Like, no, like it's too much, and we shouldn't have to do it on our own. And so we just hope to give tools and have more nuanced conversations, really. And hopefully, you know, it gets people to act in whatever capacity they can.
You heard right here, guys. So go stream the Jikes podcast of Joe. I think it's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joe. in your online activism, but also in what you share today, I think it's very insightful. You put a lot of value in the power of community and solidarity to find hope and pursue action for climate justice. If there's a young people in the audience today that doesn't know where to start from, what will you advise be for them?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like, look what's already happening in your community. You know, there's usually like groups everywhere at this point. And sometimes they might not even be called like a climate activist group, but maybe they are like a community garden, or there's a farmer's market, and where you can start talking to people. Maybe there's other social justice topics that are happening, and you can speak to them, and like you can ask them if there's something around climate, but also just, you know, support them in like their work that they're already doing. And climate justice affects all other issues, as we discussed earlier. So even though it might not be a group dedicated to climate, you can bring climate into this group. And I think that's actually sometimes where the most power for change lies, because the more we connect our social justice issues and the more we connect generally our movements and organizations, the stronger we are. And so when you first start out, you know, maybe it's scary to organize your own event. So I would say just see, especially through social media, see what's happening in your local area. If you are someone who's like really keen on organizing something, you know, speak to local venues like a cafe or something, and see if you could popularize, for example, like a World Cafe, which is usually like a space where you can just informally chat about climate, about other social justice issues. And it's a good way to get to know people as well. And you can also look, I mean, especially through the pandemic, I think people have seen how much can be done online. So, you know, regardless of where you are, you can join a group anywhere, and you can give your hands and your minds and your knowledge to that group. And yeah, but I think also like the power of local community in connection to global issues, I think is really powerful. So I would say like whatever is local, just join. And from there, you will find so many amazing people, and like whatever your skills are right now, they will be useful. And you can also learn so many new skills. So don't be intimidated and just ask people, and like they will be so glad to have you, because we need more people in these spaces, and like whatever you can give, we'll be grateful.
Thank you so much, Joe. It was a very nice talk. I really learned a little more things to start more into joining community, generating community, and fight together this climate crisis, and also this climate injustice that we live now. That was really, really amazing.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. That was a wrap for day 3 of the Youth Daily Show, the last episode for the GLF climate. We hope you enjoy it as much as we did, and that you are inspired to look more into individual and also systematic change. Don't forget to continue sharing your thoughts about the event through your social media using the hashtag GLFClimate2021. Now, before leaving, I would love to leave you all with one quote from Gangari Maathai that is really close to my heart. And it's, "I'm very conscious of the fact that you can't do it alone. It's teamwork. When you do it alone, you run the risk that when you're no longer there, nobody else will do it." So that's it for me, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you again, Joe. And thank you all. Stay in tune and hope you enjoy the rest of the GLF climate. Goodbye.